4 Degrees to the Streets is designed to empower anyone curious about places and spaces, not just persons with professional degrees or backgrounds. Here we will cover a host of topics, including transportation, health, housing, and the environment through the lens of racism, classism, and sexism, and give listeners the tools they need to overcome institutional barriers. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the number 4 Degrees Pod, and tune in every other Tuesday where Nimo and Jas keep it 4 degrees to the streets.
We back on.
Okay. We're looking at how urban planning perpetuates racism. And before we even really start talking about it, we're going to give a broad overview of urban planning. Jasmine and I have both studied urban planning, and whether we're in an Uber or at a happy hour with people we don't know, people will say, "What is that? What do you do? What is urban planning?" And I always like answering it. I find different ways. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll go into an overview of racism in America through a planning lens, and also discuss the American Planning Association's Black Lives Matter statement that they put out earlier this summer following the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And then moving forward through American Planning Association, we'll talk about some of the planners that have influenced the industry and the field over the last 100 plus years, and then get into some of the federal policies that allowed all of this to take place. Because by nature, structural racism will impact a field like planning that is so much based on structure and regulations and rules. So there's no way to kind of go through one without the other. And so, Jasmine, I know I mentioned like how I talk about urban planning. And I sometimes will I'll just give broad examples like, you can look at housing, you can look at transportation, and people just come and say, oh, okay. But what's your kind of elevator speech for urban planning, or how do you get into it?
So I think about urban planning in the context of I try to break it down very simply. So it has 2 words, urban and planning. So planning is the act of making plans for things. And then urban is focusing on a town or a city or a locality. And so urban planning is the process of making plans for a particular place. Those plans can be about transportation, how many highways do we need to have? Do we need to have more transit? Do we need to have more bike lanes? They can be about housing. Do we need to have more single family, more multifamily condos? And that's the hard thing about planning is you have people who have planning degrees like you and I, but then you also have people who have policy degrees or architecture degrees or engineering degrees that are in positions that shape the world. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think planning. Someone actually asked me today. They're like, "Oh, well, do you see yourself doing planning in 5 years?" I was like, "I don't even really know if I'm quote doing planning now."
Yeah.
Maybe planning adjacent. There's also a lot of the academia side of planning, and the research, and there's also the practical side of literally doing change that you can see on the street versus researching, as you mentioned, some of the impacts. I think planning can be so useful for things even outside. I think the skills you learn from planning, and understanding how it shapes your built environment, is helpful in whatever type of field or industry that you work in. Because it all connects. I just feel like planning is very interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
So.
And I sometimes wonder if getting a planning degree, like a Master's of City and Regional Planning is the official name of the degree. I sometimes wonder if getting that degree was useful or if it would have been better to get a different type of degree. I mean, it's too late now in my life.
I know what to say. It's too late.
It is what it is. But I did think about it, and I'm not really sure. what the answer is, because there's so many. I think it really just depends on your passions and your motivation. Like, I'm really driven to not be a quote unquote academic or even a planner that publishes a lot of written plans. I'm very much invested in getting things done.
Yeah, and I think the degree is good for that because it kind of makes you a jack of all trades.
Yeah,
You'll learn how to like basically walk it like you talk it or talk it like you walk it. Either way,
he
you can
goes.
talk about it or right. You can talk about it or you can actually do it. And yeah, it just continues to interest me. I never thought I'd end up on the finance side
Mm,
of city planning. But that's kind of where I'm at, and a lot of that touches, like you mentioned, transportation policies. A lot of it is like, okay, well, what we spend money on is essentially saying what policies we are prioritizing,
yeah.
and getting to see how that shows up.
And that's the challenge. And I don't want to keep harping on what is urban planning, but I've always been very proud that you're in the finance aspect of it, because I've heard someone say before, um, it's not what people tell you that they care about, it's where they put their money. And I think
Hmm.
we're coming to see that more in terms of the organizations that we support and that we finance, and seeing like the types of candidates that they give campaign dollars to. But it happens the same thing in the city. Cities make great plans about they want to do these huge urban infrastructure projects, and then you look at their budget and they
Where
haven't
it at though?
they haven't any money allocated any money to it. And so it's not necessarily what you say you care about, it's where you put your money at. And I'm so glad that you work in the finance and budget area, because you really get to, in your capacity as much as you can, shape where some of those finance decisions are going. And that ultimately is, nothing gets done without money, so that
Yeah.
ultimately is planning.
Yeah, no, it's very clear when something gets defunded or funded how important it is,
Yeah.
to the leadership. Um, so, did we touch on like I guess the history of planning, like when America is still racist, so
Yep.
therefore planning is still racist.
Hmm.
Urban planning in America is inherently racist in nature. However, I think the training of planners is increasingly trying to get professional planners to think about equity and to think about racism and to think about discrimination and how we can now hold the pen to undo some of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think, speaking, since I'm still in planning school, I think one of the major downfalls of planning school, like, and I can talk about the MCRP degree and an undergraduate degree in urban planning, is I think that those equity conversations start with an assumption that everybody understands how racism is how racism was created, defined, and proliferates in America. Like, I think everyone, the professors rather, come into the assumption that everyone joining to this first cohort of MCRP degrees has taken in historically accurate American history class. And
mm,
I don't think that that's the case. I've been in school
yeah.
enough times to know that's not the case. So what I'm gonna try to do for the first, I'm gonna do a very, very quick, and it's definitely not meant to substitute or rather replace any lesson that you can pull from a book like The New Jim Crow or Slavery by Another Name, but or any other accurate history book of racism in America. But I'm going to try to break down like how we got where we are right now before we go into the ways that local government or federal government or even the planners that we regard with such high prestige in the field were racist. Um, so we have to have this conversation about the history of racism in America. I'm going to try to hit some of the main historical timelines and like points and get us to a place of like common understanding. So we have to start with America in its foundation. The 4th of July, 1766, it's when we sign our Constitution saying that all men are created equal. Watch Hamilton on Disney Plus if you have it. At that point in time when we're writing that Constitution, it's like the men in that room had zero regard for women of all races, but also black men, black women, and black children that were held literally as property, as slaves in the North, in the South. Everyone wants to always talk about it as a South problem, but it was in New York City as well. So then years later, we had the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and it was supposedly supposed to free the slaves that were abused during slavery. So slavery was a very violent period. Whenever you're trying to treat a human being like property, you have to then treat them inhumanely. And so they were beaten, lynched, raped, murdered, families intentionally torn apart, mothers forced to have sex with strangers, forced to have sex with the white master to continuously reproduce more and more bodies that could be used for labor. So the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, supposed to end all of that. It doesn't. We go through the Civil War, in which all of these the battles are happening between the Southern Confederate and the American Union. In the end, the Union wins, but it takes an additional 2 years for all slaves to kind of be made aware of their freedom. So that's why we celebrate June 19th, 1865, or Juneteenth. This is the day that the last group of Union soldiers finally made their way to Galveston, Texas, to let the slaves in East Texas know, like, you are free. And so I think people have to, because no one still alive here was around at that time, but imagine for over hundreds of years, you're born into slavery, your mother was born into slavery, your grandmother was born into slavery, you're dehumanized for so long, and someone's coming to tell you, you're free, you can walk around and do whatever you want. It's not going to be like in 5 minutes, I'm going to jump up and I'm going to do whatever I need to do. So it takes time for those people, those prior slaves, to unlearn that mindset. But then the powers that be, those states, particularly southern states at this time, implemented a series of policies that were designed to keep Black people in a lower class position, not even lower class, like really designed to try to dehumanize them even further, now through policy. So now we have Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws that would prevent these former slaves from even acquiring property, from going to school, from building families, from doing any of the things that's human nature. So then many of these Black families were working as sharecroppers as a way to make money, because they weren't being paid before as slaves. So now they're working as sharecroppers and they're still not being paid. They're working probably on the same plantation or the plantation over, living in the quarters, and at the end of the season, they're being told, oh, you don't owe us anything. So that was them not having to get paid again. We broke even. The amount of money I spent on providing shelter for you and your family, it's the same amount of money that you would have made working in the field. And so you get paid nothing. There were day laborers who made maybe 50 cents a day. And this is just what life was. So Black people start to feel like we need to get out of this situation. How do we do it? So there's the promotion of the Great Migration, which really happened at an individual level. And there's a great book called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, and she talks about how Black people didn't mobilize, and there wasn't a voice of, we're all going to move to the North. They saw an opportunity, and individual families took advantage of it, and over time it became a movement, and they were just making these decisions to better themselves, and it just became a huge deal. And so you see these droves of African Americans leaving places like Chickasaw County in Mississippi and Albany, Georgia, and Monroe, Louisiana, and Eustis, Florida, and they're moving to New York. They're moving to Milwaukee. They're taking trips all the way to Los Angeles. They're moving to Chicago. And it seems like once they get there, that's when all of these kind of federal level policies of racism begin to get implemented, and these state and local policies that perpetuate racism begin to get implemented, because there was no reason for the city of Chicago, for example, to have segregated zoning, because this population of black people in Chicago was so miniature that it was useless. But as their population goes from 1% black to 10%, now it becomes an issue of these white people who had been living in the North and had been not necessarily accustomed to interacting with black people regularly are now angry, and they don't want to compete for jobs with black people, and so they're trying to keep them out of their workplaces and also trying to keep them out of their neighborhoods. And so that's when you start to see all of these policies that are race and class based, because there wasn't a need for it while black people were in bondage and while they were, for the majority of the country, in the South.
And I guess what I would want the takeaway to be from the history of racism, I think what always echoes for me is that we're not that far behind
Yeah.
from where it all happened. Like my parents were born in 1968. And that was, as we think about it, that was the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. That's always kind of the reminder for me that they were alive during that time. And so that's 52 years ago.
Yeah.
That's not that far away from, or as you mentioned, the things that your grandfather recalled. And so throughout the history of this country, there was not equal footing solely based on race.
Yeah, there never was.
And so in terms of the American Planning Association, they had put out a statement, I think it was at the end of May or early June, titled APA Statement on Righting the Wrongs of Racial Inequality. And Jasmine and I had talked about this statement once we saw it then, and just kind of our thoughts on it. And on social media, there was a lot of feedback for the APA in the comments section on their thoughts. So we just wanted to spend some time as we talk in this episode about racism and planning, what the national planning body is saying and what they're doing.
Yeah. So I want to
get some of your thoughts,
because I know there's some people who probably don't know what the heck APA is. So APA is the American Planning Association. Every profession has a quote unquote professional association. I'm not sure what it is for lawyers, but for doctors, wow, I'm not actually sure what it is for doctors. Do you know what the one is for like doctors? Like, give me an example of another one. The American Psychological Association, American Public Health Association.
There's an American Institute for Architects, I think. American Public Health Association.
So this is just another version of that. They offer training, and they're like the leading policy, I guess, advocacy body for the planning profession. So I'll just read briefly what they have in the beginning. The APA is heartbroken over the brutal senseless killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis this week and the immense pain inflicted on the Black community, which continues to suffer from insidious and blatant effects of structural racism. Moving forward, APA recognizes this reality. They're working to center equity in all planning processes. They have a planning for equity policy guide, the APA Code of Ethics, and a new online public engagement tool, wanting to make sure that all voices are heard and eradicate the bad policy decisions of the past. Let's stand in solidarity with all communities of color. Nationwide at this painful time, moving beyond righteous anger, and advocating for peaceful dialogue that educates and builds and bonds great communities of all. I
think that's the part I have the most.
Okay, get into it.
Yeah, I think that sentence just really makes me furrow my brows a little bit. I think we all as a people have a lot of learning and unlearning to do about how we talk about certain things. But you can't say righteous anger, which I'm not even really sure what they mean by that, and then advocate for peaceful dialogue when that is not the situation on both sides. If we just sit and flash back to June when the president of the United States enacted, National Guard and basically called a war against protest, that was pretty violent, and aggressive, to say that there needs to be a peaceful dialogue.
Yeah.
Why police people's right, like why police anger that is real and that's based in true frustration and just being done, because we've been patient, we've been asking for things, and so if the dialogue isn't peaceful, then does that make it less needed to be heard? I think the other thing that stands out to me, is the using the quote all language, all communities. What was the other one? Center equity in all planning processes. Um, yeah, to me, that is not specific enough,
Yeah.
and it paints a brush over what are you actually going to do? What planning processes are you as a national association going to make recommendations to change?
Mhm.
And I think only using George Floyd in this example and makes it seem like racial inequity is new.
Yeah.
I don't think they go into. I would have liked to see an acknowledgement about the history of racism in planning, and that was missing for me.
Yeah, I think they attempted to do that in the very last sentence where they said, "We're working to help planners and others recognize and eradicate the bad policy decisions of the past." So I feel the same way, that the profession has too much influence to be an ally. We're not talking about, and I think everyone, I can't think of a profession that shouldn't, like, there's a difference between being an ally and being an agent of change. And I'm trying to think of an profession that has the ability to be an ally. Instead of being an agent of change. But like the APA should be an agent of change. And I guess that's where I'm trying to go. I think about the NBA
I
and
was about to say, I think these sports feel like they're allies
yeah,
safely, and there's just not. But yeah, I think they're allies. They can be like, oh, we know we support, but they don't really get into it.
yeah, but I also feel like it's really not their job. Like,
True, they can get away with it.
they didn't sign up to be, that's different than APA. Like, American Planning Association and people who have planning degrees, people who want to be planners, people who work in planning areas, signed up to, literally, our code of ethics is about improving the quality of life for all. It says that in the code of ethics. Basketball players sign up to play basketball and make money. The fact that they have to boycott games, they have to wear t-shirts, it's like that's all what they feel like they want to do, but it's really not on them to carry the torch of
Yeah.
justice. Like, they're not elected officials, they're not public servants, they're basketball players. We don't pay them out of our personal tax dollars or anything. We pay them by patronizing their games and buying their jerseys. So the fact that
Mm-hmm.
they are the ones leading the charge is embarrassing for the country, honestly.
Right, and I don't know if enough people are thinking about it like that. But yeah, so when we were thinking about these topics, we went through several iterations, but we've just covered a lot of information. We went through defining urban planning, um, giving a history of racism in America, which is, heavy on any day, and then looking to more present day in terms of what the American Planning Association is saying about Black Lives Matter in 2020. So we're going to take a quick pin in it here and come back and continue discussing planning and racism from the aspect of historical planners that have influenced the field: Robert Moses, William White, Jane Jacobs, and then also talk about the federal planning policies that influence racism. So stay tuned for that.
Hey, what's up? I'm Micah Kimberly.
Hey, everybody. It's me, Ty Perkins, and together we host a show called Music Crush Monday.
You can check us out every Monday for your dose of trending topics, new music, and tracks from the hottest up-and-coming artists all across the world. Follow us at Micah Kimberly, MICAHKIMBERLEY on Instagram.
Follow me at DyeTai, DYETAI on Instagram, and subscribe to us on YouTube at GVO Nation so you can watch the show.
We hope to see you there.
Welcome back, y'all. Thanks for riding with us for the second half of this episode. So in every field, there are like the founders of the field or the people that champion the field. And so there's several in planning. Most of them are white men. The one that's probably most notable is Robert Moses. Not only is he notable because of the stuff that he did. I mean, he built so many roads, so many parks, so many bridges, so many tunnels. But he was also in New York City, and everyone knows New York City is the best city in America. So, Robert Moses, what'd you say?
I said, is it? I actually miss New York though during this pandemic times. I wish I could go up there to New York or Jersey and see y'all.
I took train recently, but we'll get into that later. Of how that train was during COVID. So we're going to talk about how these planners might have done some great things for the field, but how they didn't do great things for Black people and minorities as a whole in America. So we're going to start with the one that's most known for his racist actions, and that's Robert Moses. So most of my knowledge about Robert Moses comes from a book written about him called The Power Broker, The Rise and Fall of New York's Greatest Builder. So Robert Moses, a Jewish American man living in New York City, he built anything that you can think of in New York City: the Triborough Bridge, the Throgs Neck Bridge, the Cross Bronx Expressway, FDR, Riverside Drive, all these different roads, and all these different great parkways. Jones Beach, that's his like most notable beach, Rockaway Beach. He was involved heavily as the parks construction manager and the city construction manager in building all these things. But he was a very racist man. I'm going to talk about one thing that he did that shows you how he was racist against minorities and not just Black people. So the Cross Bronx Expressway, if you guys look at a map, you'll see that it runs east to west across the borough of the Bronx in New York. For the most part, it runs at a straight line, except until it gets to the eastern border of the Bronx, where it makes kind of like an upside down V. It jumps up and then it jumps back down near Crotona Park. And this area it's a 1 mile stretch in a neighborhood called East Tremont. And I'm going to tell you the story of this neighborhood to express to you the level of disregard for minorities that Robert Moses experienced. So this neighborhood in the 1940s and 1950s was an integrated Jewish, German, Slavic, and Black neighborhood in the Bronx. It flourished. It had entertainment venues, high-end shop, low-end shops. The Black people, the white people, the Jewish people all lived in quote-unquote harmony with each other. There were not instances of race riots and white flight type of things that happened as Black people moved to different neighborhoods. White people would move further away. Those types of things didn't occur in this particular neighborhood. It had high-end shops, grocery stores, entertainment, like I said. The Power Broker book talks about Robert Moses' decision to design this part of the Cross Bronx Expressway to intentionally demolish somewhere near 1,305 apartments. By taking this particular northern spike and then southern spike in the route, he would demolish the entire neighborhood. He considered it to be a slum and that it was not worth saving. the neighborhood mobilized together trying to save their community. They didn't want their neighborhood to be demolished. They didn't want to find new places to live. They wanted to stay where they were. And so they worked with the Bronx County chapter of the New York State Society of Engineers to develop an alternate route to the Cross Bronx Expressway that would take over a portion of Crotona Park and allow the highway to stay on a kind of straight path across the Bronx. The plan was approved by the Society of Engineers. It was approved by the City Council. It was approved by the mayor. It met all engineering standards. It saved money in the project, and it preserved all these housing units. Robert Moses had complete disregard for the plan, and because he was the final say in the design of the route, he completely ignored these people's concern about their neighborhood, and he did it intentionally. And he's famously known for saying that you have to cut through the city with a meat axe, and he was not afraid of demolishing, and he took pleasure in demolishing neighborhoods to build his highways, even though there were cheaper, faster, safer, less hazardous routes that avoided this neighborhood entirely. And I think those two stories really tell about who he was as a person, that he was so concerned with having things his way and his just outright demise, really, for people of color, whether they be Eastern Europeans or Black people. He just had no regard for their life, their well-being, and he was willing to increase the cost of his project just to demolish their neighborhood.
But do we think that even though, like, objectively, someone could say, but he got it done?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you think there are good things that came from Robert Moses' approach that maybe people can learn from?
I think that there are things. The way that he was able to cut through bureaucracy, the way that he was able to take his planning, his plans from a piece of paper to a construction project is remarkable. I just wish that he wouldn't have been so racist in how he did it, honestly. I mean, you look at the Cross Bronx Expressway, that's just one neighborhood that he demolished, but he demolished stretches of neighborhoods in the Bronx. When he built his highways, he made sure that the tunnels, like the overpasses for other streets, were so low that public buses couldn't go through them.
Yeah.
But I also think there's something unique about when he came of age. We were in the middle of FDR, and there was a lot of money available at the federal level to do
construct roadways,
construction projects. Yeah, and I don't think that money is available now, which doesn't make it possible. Like, he was able to do all those things because, like we talked about, money was available, and it was a goal of that administration to build up our nation's economy through infrastructure projects.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert Moses saw that and took advantage of it, so that New York was always the one to get the money first, because there were national level competitions for funding, and DC applied, Baltimore applied, but they didn't have any shit together, honestly. And so New York got the money, and they got the money because of Robert Moses. So I think the time period really helped him.
I feel like there needs to be another uprising of federal funds for transportation projects.
I'm with it.
However many years later, to undo some of what's been done, but that's ambitious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, someone else who came to mind in terms of who we learn about in planning school was William Levitt. And, well, I know you also grew up in the suburbs.
Sure did.
I, too, grew up in the suburbs, about 30 minutes south of Seattle. And a lot of what I saw in suburbia actually stemmed my interest for planning when I discovered planning as a senior in high school. So I was kind of young. But I was always fascinated. I was fascinated how, you know, the little subdevelopment of homes that we lived in. We drove down a little windy road, and when we got to the main road that would connect us to the interstate, how when I moved in, there was just a little gas station. And then by the time in 10 years, that became a plaza with an LA Fitness and a Starbucks and a nail salon, and just this whole, development that we all used to sneak out of high school to go grab lunch at. But I was just always fascinated, like, how did this development happen and why? But what I never really thought about was the root of suburbia. That was not until actually taking housing classes and planning classes about the flight from the city and how that was also rooted in racism, white flight, which is white people moving to the suburbs to avoid the racially diverse areas of the city that had become disinvested and had more low-income people. So the suburbs was seen as a relief. So I'd always known that, but looking into like the history of suburbia, which William Levitt, all that intro just to say that. William Levitt is known as the father of suburbia, and how that started was in Levittown, New York, after war veterans came back and they had their, veteran housing vouchers to buy homes. He was a real estate developer. And so he had built an entire community of homes that were identical. Kind of when you think about, I guess, housing in the 50s, some of those, houses obviously still standing, but all pretty much look the same. And so people coming back from war, families, they wanted these homes. It was a planned community where they would feel that they all could look and live in houses that all look the same. But with living in all those houses that look the same, they're also living with people who look like them. And anything else was not acceptable. And so William Levitt's argument was that if he only wanted to sell homes to whites, and that if he sold one house to a black family, then whites would not buy into the community. And he said that he wasn't being racist. He just said it's business. He said it is what it is, and no black folks can live here. And basically suburbs made it so that whites could get away from the racial diversities in cities. And when they built another Levittown in Pennsylvania, a black family, the Myers family, was the first family to desegregate. And they were met with all types of violence and protests outside of their homes. And it wasn't until, so eventually after going through all of that, slowly but surely, more diverse families, black families, were able to move into these first suburbs of America. And so when I think about my experience growing up in suburbia, it was not always pleasant. There were, my parents still live in a different suburb now, but being one of the few black families, it's not a majority black neighborhood, and so you get looks. You feel like people walking their dogs, and you want to say hi, but they just kind of look at you like you're an alien. And
people talk about, and I say that I'm really truly blessed, because that was just not my experience growing up in the suburbs of New Jersey. And I know that there are suburbs like that in New Jersey, but I think because I live in what they call the inner ring suburbs, so you think about the city as being the center, and then there's kind of a first set of neighborhoods, and as you go further and further out, the suburbs get more suburban, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I don't live in a neighborhood where all the houses are the same. In everyone's lots, like some people's lots are close to the street, some are further away. Like I live in a very intermingled community, and when I grew up, my whole street was black people. Like,
oh wow, that was not my experience.
My bus to school was mostly black kids. Like, but my township is integrated. Like their high school and everything is mixed, but the neighborhoods within the township are interestingly segregated. Like I grew up definitely around a lot of black people, and I don't remember interacting with white people. When I did, it was never negative. That's not an experience for everybody, I'm sure. I think
Yeah, and I think it goes back to some of what we were talking about earlier. If y'all listen to part one of this, in terms of Black families moving to the North to have a promise of a better life, I think a lot of Black families, like the Jetsons, or moving on up. Is that the Jetsons?
Mm-hmm.
No.
The Jeffersons, not the Jetsons. The Jetsons is the futuristic cartoon.
Yeah. Okay, the Jeffersons. Yeah.
What do you
think? And being able to move into a house in the suburbs is seen as you're making a better way for your family.
Yeah.
Only to get there and still in this time be met with, just feeling like an outsider. I remember we got notes on our doors, and just really like nasty stuff had happened from the time that we lived there.
Wow.
But back in the late 40s and 50s, for them to start off the idea of suburbia as only selling to whites because Blacks are seen as undesirable, that's just prejudice and racist in itself. And so if that suburbia still exists today, obviously, but I think it's important to look at the roots, and that being the root of suburbia, how could that not be materialized and what housing looks like today?
Yeah.
And so I'd be curious to hear from potentially like a real estate agent or investor what their perspective would be on that.
I'm gonna play a clip from the book that I mentioned earlier, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, in which she talks about some of the challenges that Black families went through as they tried to move from inner cities or from the South into suburban neighborhoods. And it's important to understand like why they wanted to move. So I think she outlines that pretty well. And we're going to get into the policy that made it legal for William Levitt to design his housing this way. So I'm going to start playing the clip now.
Harvey Clark was from Mississippi like Ida May and brought his family to Chicago in 1949 after serving in World War II. Now that they were in the big city, the couple and their 2 children were crammed into half of a 2-room apartment. A family of 5 lived in the other half. Harvey Clark was paying $56 a month for the privilege, up to 50% more than tenants in white neighborhoods paid for the same amount of space. One-room tenement life did not fit them at all. The husband and wife were college-educated, well-mannered, and looked like movie stars. The father had saved up for a piano for his 8-year-old daughter with the ringlets down her back, but had no place to put it. He had high aspirations for their 6-year-old son, who was bright and whose dimples could have landed him in cereal commercials. The Clarks felt they had to get out. By May of 1951, they finally found the perfect apartment. It had 5 rooms, was clean and modern, was closer to the bus terminal, and cost only $60 a month. That came to $4 a month more for 5 times more space. It was just a block over the Chicago line at 6139 West 19th Street in the working-class suburb of Cicero. The Clarks couldn't believe their good fortune. Cicero was an all-white town on the southwest border of Chicago. It was known as the place Al Capone went to elude Chicago authorities back during Prohibition. The town was filled with first- and second-generation immigrants, Czechs, Slavs, Poles, Italians. Some had fled fascism and Stalinism, not unlike blacks fleeing oppression in the South, and were still getting established in the New World. They lived in frame cottages and worked the factories and slaughterhouses. They lived in frame cottages and worked the factories and slaughterhouses. They were miles from the Black Belt, isolated from it, and bent on keeping their town as it was. That the Clarks turned there at all was an indication of how closed the options were for colored families looking for clean, spacious housing they could afford. The Clarks set the move-in date for the 3rd week of June. The moving truck arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon. White protesters met them as the couple tried to unload the truck. "Get out of Cicero," the protesters told them, "and don't come back." As the Clarks started to enter the building, the police stopped them at the door. The police took sides with the protesters and would not let the Clarks nor their furniture in. "You should know better," the chief of police told them. "Get going. Get out of here fast. There will be no moving in that building." The Clarks, along with their rental agent, Charles Edwards, fled the scene. "Don't come back in town," the chief reportedly told Edwards, "or you'll get a bullet through you." The Clarks did not let that deter them, but sued and won the right to occupy the apartment. They tried to move in again on July 11th, 1951. This time, 100 Cicero housewives and grandmothers in swing coats and Mamie Eisenhower hats showed up to heckle them. The couple managed to get their furniture in, but as the day wore on, the crowds grew larger and more agitated. A man from a white supremacy group called the White Circle League handed out flyers that said, "Keep Cicero white." The Clarks fled. A mob stormed the apartment and threw the family's furniture out of a 3rd-floor window as the crowds cheered below. The Clarks fled. A mob stormed the apartment and threw the family's furniture out of a 3rd-floor window as the crowds cheered below. The neighbors burned the couple's marriage license and the children's baby pictures. They overturned the refrigerator and tore the stove and plumbing fixtures out of the wall. They tore up the carpet. They shattered the mirrors. They bashed in the toilet bowl. They ripped out the radiators. They smashed the piano Clark had worked overtime to buy for his daughter. And when they were done, they set the whole pile of the family's belongings, now strewn on the ground below, on fire. In an hour, the mob destroyed what had taken 9 years to acquire, wrote the historian Stephen Grant Meyer of what happened that night. The next day, a full-out riot was underway.
So, that's Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. She's talking about a black family that attempted to leave tenement housing in Chicago for more space for only $4 more a month, 5 times more space, and they were met with riots. They were met with the police siding with the rioters, and were forced out of the place that they wanted to move to, and assumingly forced back into more tenement housing, even though they had the financial means to live in other places. And so I wanted to play that because it embodies what we're talking about throughout this episode.
Yeah, I just take a minute to
take it all in,
to reflect and process. Like I said in the beginning, this is a important topic, but it's kind of a sad topic when you just think about the history of all that happened, and that people who are in positions of power and leadership, and even in the planning field, were able to enable the justification of not allowing for people to live where they wanted to live.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to talk about, I can talk about William White, although I feel like he's the least problematic. So we can briefly talk about him, or we can just go to Jane Jacobs. I think we should just go to Jane Jacobs.
Yeah, we'll just go to Jane Jacobs.
Shout out to William White for valuing places. I remember, going in school doing his, what is it called? Social eyes on the street or something, basically observing and being a people watcher. And one of the quote that I'll say by him, and then we can move on to Jane Jacobs, is, as we talked about, Blacks being seen as undesirable in certain neighborhoods. But his quote was, so-called undesirables are not the problem. It is the measures taken to combat them that is the problem. So how people are seen as undesirable is one thing, but what do people do to act on that is really what the issue is, and where a lot of the hatred comes in.
I agree. Jane Jacobs, the only female kind of mentioned in when people tell the history of the urban planning profession. She's most notably known for her, I don't know if that makes sense as a sentence, her opposition to Robert Moses. He attempted to build a highway through Washington Square Park in Lower Manhattan, which is now kind of the campus square for NYU, if you can imagine it. Her and a group of other white women in the Lower East Side were successful in thwarting his plan to make a cross Manhattan highway. They were one of the only people ever to successfully thwart one of Robert Moses' plans, or even a part of his plan. I told you the story about the family in East Tremont. So even the act that her, as a white woman, was able to do that talks to her privilege, because the Jewish, Black, German, and Slavic families in East Tremont were unsuccessful, even though they had the Bronx County chapter of engineers on their side. So anyway, I read through her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's one of the great planning works produced. Students in planning school are given chapters to read. I read the whole thing. Throughout her book, she acknowledges that there's a treatment of. She's writing the book in the 50s and 60s, so she's acknowledging that there's an unfair treatment of Black and Hispanic Americans, particularly in New York, but she doesn't present any policy recommendations to change it. And I think she's the most problematic because her entire book is a criticism of urban planning, of urban design, of architecture, and of city policy, but yet she doesn't present any recommendations for how they can improve conditions for minorities in New York City. She makes all these recommendations about
She
how
just acted as if they weren't there.
yeah, so she talked about it, and I think that is one of the biggest issues with people who say they're quote unquote colorblind, is that they can say, I acknowledge this injustice, but I'm going to keep going about my day as if it doesn't exist. And the privilege that she has as a white woman to do that is telling. Like, I don't get to go about my day and acknowledge racism exists but not do anything about it, because it affects me. Because it doesn't affect her, I think she didn't have to spend time in her book to address it. I'm going to leave it there because I know we want to talk about policy level things that structure racism in America. And so since we just talked about housing, I'm going to start with the housing area first. And the most important thing to talk about with the housing policy is in the 1930s, America goes through the Great Depression, stock market crashes, savings and loans, banks, all those things. Home buying at that time was not very simple. So today, if you want to buy a home, you need somewhere between 10 and 20% of the home's value as a down payment. You can get a 30-year mortgage at very low interest rates, and you can pay it off slowly in 30 years. In this time period in the 1930s, that structure didn't exist. People had to put down something like 50% of a home. So a $100,000 house, they had to put down $50,000 and pay off the rest in like 2 or 3 years. So the structure wasn't there. FDR creates this Federal Housing Administration in the National Housing Act, which comes up with the idea of an amortized mortgage, meaning that your mortgage is federally backed by the federal government. If you default on your mortgage, meaning you can't make your payments, the federal government assumes the risk. You go into foreclosure, of course, but it doesn't leave banks with the bag of money not being filled. And so, in order to expand his big housing program, and the reason why he did this housing program is because owning homes builds wealth. You buy a house for $50,000, and in 10 years it becomes worth $75,000. You just earned $25,000. So that was why there was a big federal level push for home ownership. In order to do any kind of mortgage lending, there's a whole process of underwriting. And so the Federal Housing Administration created an underwriting manual in 1935 that determined the standards they would give to developers and banks who were building homes, the developers, and issuing mortgages to potential buyers. And that underwriting manual was inherently racist. You can Google the underwriting manual today, FHA Underwriting Manual 1935, and read it. But I'm going to give you some of the points in it that I thought were the most problematic. So the first one was that they advised banks against making loans, either redevelopment loans or home improvement loans, in urban neighborhoods because, and I quote, older properties have a tendency to accelerate the rate of transition into lower class occupancy. So this policy, while it seems to be class-based, is inherently racist because Black people were forced to remain in urban neighborhoods. We just listened to what happened when a Black family in Chicago attempted to leave Chicago for the suburbs. They were met with all kinds of violence. And so Black people were forced into urban areas, and then the federal government is telling banks and developers, we're really not going to give you money if you develop in urban areas. And so Black people lived in housing that was subpar because no one would put the money in to do any home improvement or build any new buildings. Secondly, the manual had this explicit policy that, if I quote, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to occupy the same social and racial classes. All mortgages on properties protected from unfavorable influences, there in quotes, integration, will obtain a high rating. And so you talk about William Levitt and his suburban towns, Levittown in PA and in New York, and why he was able to say, I'm only selling to white people, is because he probably got a loan from the Federal Housing Administration. He did, actually, I know this. Got a loan from the Federal Housing Administration that told him your loan is only guaranteed so long as you don't sell to Black people and white people. And so they were forced to build a whole development and only sell it to white people. So that completely excluded Black people from moving to the suburbs and accumulating the wealth that comes from buying a house as it appreciates in value. And so I wrote some things down that I wanted to talk about. So there were not only were they excluded, people might say, well, they could just build Black only suburbs, but they didn't. No, there were no Black people at the time that had the financial resources to become a major housing developer. And so all the housing developers were white people, and they were building houses for other white people. So there was no way for there to be all Black new suburban buildings. When there were new Black construction, it happened in the form of public housing, which I'm going to talk about now. So again, part of FDR, there was this huge public works administration that was created through this National Industrial Recovery Act. And the goal was to provide federally built housing, but also to expand jobs in the construction industry. There was a housing division which was tasked with financing the construction of public housing, which is entirely built. Most people know them as project buildings. The administration had a strict manual that prohibited integrated housing developments. So whenever a city wanted to build a public housing unit, they had to build one that was explicitly for Blacks and one that was explicitly for whites. if they had the money to build both. So think about how much more money it costs when you have to build two separate developments that are exactly the same rather than one that can house both demographics. They would also only locate the public housing buildings in areas that were segregated. So the black public housing unit would have to go in the black section of the city, and the white public housing unit would have to go in the white section of the city. Now that might sound, all fair and good, whatever, separate but equal, all that BS. You have to understand that the public housing developments were built cheaply as to not compete with private housing construction. And so from the beginning, the National Real Estate Board didn't want the federal government involved in public housing because they knew that it would undercut the value of privately sold housing. So the federal housing had to be built in a shabby manner. It's why you look at project buildings in New York, in DC, and Baltimore, and they look frankly bad. They look like places that it's your last resort to live in or your only option to live in. And that was done intentionally because they did not want to compete with the private housing market, individual developers and property owners buying and selling land. And so this becomes a really big issue because white people had options to live wherever they wanted. We just talked about how black people were restricted from moving into certain housing neighborhoods. White people didn't have that same issue. And so more and more than anything, the waiting list for the black housing development was so long. Meanwhile, they have vacancies in the white housing development, but they couldn't move any families in them. And so that's the first issue. But the second issue is that we already know that separate but equal is a hoax. By segregating the races, it's very easy to direct funding for repairs and housing developments into the development that has the whole white population and not into those with the black population. And so those two level policies, the way that the public housing was designed and operated, and the way that we institutionalized federally backed mortgages, are two of the main ways that racism is perpetuated in urban planning through housing policy. So, what do you have to say about that, Nimo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a lot in terms of historically what was acceptable, and admittedly, I have not delved into housing. I think it's interesting, but it just hasn't been where I focused any of my research or like present day like work on what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I think a lot of the inequities are still seen today. I think housing has truly a long way to go. I don't know if we're going to talk about this in a later episode, but in terms of the remedies of what has been put in place, and I think it's important to still think about what else can still be done to address the current housing conditions that people have and the housing options that they have.
I'm going to touch on highway design because I think people look at infrastructure as being objective, but it isn't. It's very
nope, not at all.
And so there's the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, also known as the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act, which was created by the Eisenhower administration with a stated and explicit goal of expanding our interstate highway system for national security purposes. Many are unaware of the racial biases that were baked into this policy. So Roosevelt, while he was president, he began meeting with different advisors about how we could use this highway system. There were two kind of guidance documents prepared. The first was written by the then Agriculture Secretary Henry Raleigh, called Toll Roads and Free Roads, and then the second one was written by Thomas McDonald of the Bureau of Public Roads, called Interregional Highways. And both the reports made strong cases that highway development could be used to remove slums and be used for urban renewal and urban clearance. We saw that Robert Moses. This policy is what made Robert Moses able to do what he did in East Tremont.
Well, and I think I think that's like still something that's done today. I've seen it in terms of like this, for instance, like homelessness in DC. But I think one thing that seems good will be used to be a remedy for something that is seen to be bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when it impacts people's livelihoods, the thing that could seem good, and I'm being kind of vague right now, intentionally, I think the thing that can be seen as good, so in this instance, highways is good, but it's going to remove housing for poor people.
Yeah.
That's seen as inherently bad, but that's where people live. Like that's someone's home.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes the thing that's good also bad. So I think if highways is done to do, it's meant to take away something that's a essential need in life is housing and shelter, and I think it's partly bad.
Yeah, I agree. The article reads, and I'm going to quote it: land acquisition in these slum areas for highway construction and urban development would result in the elimination of unsightly and unsanitary district where land values are constantly depreciating. And I'll give you an example. Now, there's examples in DC. We just talked about the Cross Bronx Expressway. There's examples in Baltimore, examples in Chicago, San Francisco, LA, of how highways were used to demolish neighborhoods of people of color intentionally. And so I'm going to talk about Overton in Miami. So Interstate 95, I-95 goes from Maine to Miami, I believe, cuts through New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, all the way down to Miami. It was planned to terminate in Miami. The planners had been proposing multiple alternative routes. So when you propose a highway, everyone's trying to figure out the fastest and the cheapest route to do it. The route that was chosen ended up cutting directly through the center of this black neighborhood called Overton in Miami. It was not a slum, even though all the media at that time was trying to make it into a slum. It was a place where black business elite lived, where singers from New York would come to perform. It was like the center of activity for black life in Miami. There were law offices and tailors and doctors' offices and restaurants. And there were a lot of immigrants there from Caribbean islands such as the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados, etc. And so the Miami business elite that worked in the downtown area didn't want the highway. If you look at a map of Miami, you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see where downtown Miami is. You'll see where 95 is. And they didn't want the highway to come too close to downtown because they anticipated that downtown would expand to the west. And so as a result, the highway was built to demolish this entire neighborhood. And there were nearly 60,000 people that lived in this area. And just one interchange of 95 demolished like 10 blocks in the direction of this neighborhood. And so that's one example of how highways were used to demolish black communities. We can look at Atlanta. Look at I-85, I-75 in Atlanta. What is the rationale for that big U? If you look at the map, the road is going north and south, then it cuts east, and then cuts back west, and then goes north and south again. They demolished an entire black neighborhood that was adjacent to downtown at that point. You look at the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco, the same thing, Cross Bronx Expressway. So over and over and over again, we see how something that could be seen as being objective, a highway, we need that, interstate commerce, all these great things, end up being used strategically to hurt Black and brown communities. And that's the most frustrating part about it, is that a policy on the surface can seem quote unquote colorblind,
Yeah.
but its effects, and sometimes they're intentional, were to demolish and to continuously hurt Black and brown communities.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really a really good transition into another policy area that continued to perpetuate racism, that I'll talk about from the lens of environmental issues and environmental pollution. And highways are also a big part of that, as they, in themselves, living along a highway, there's so much pollution that
Air
one
quality
gets. Right, air quality. I was slipping and couldn't think of the name. But in terms of the environment, I can't remember when I read this. I don't even know if I read the book, but when I had to read a part of it or something in school. But the book was Environmental Justice from the Ground Up, by Luke Cole and Sheila Foster. Do you remember reading that book ever or coming across it?
No, but I'm going to add it to my list.
Yeah, I think I think it came out in like 2001, but I think it gave a good history and overview of how environmental justice even became a thing, and how the executive order that we'll talk about in a later episode, signed by Clinton in '94, was the first recognition of environmental justice and environmental racism. But if we take a look back, like, how did that even become a problem? And I think the problem is rooted in planning practices. When we look at land use, zoning, and and how land use and zoning decisions. And in the book, they talk about how a race neutral criteria was used for determining waste facilities, when it was not race neutral in any way. But that was how they called it. And they looked at African American communities that were completely stable. So these were not slums, these were not blighted areas. And they allowed those areas to be downzoned. So they were residential. So this is something that, planning jurisdictions and their planning offices have control over their zoning.
Talk about what zoning is for people who might not know what zoning.
That was my best description. I mean, like, zoning is, if you look at a town, there are certain uses that can be done in a certain area. So, for instance, I live in an apartment building in DC. If you look at a map from an aerial view, this area, literally the block by block, streets around my building, is zoned as a residential area because people live here. And then if you just go down the street from me, there's a Walmart that is zoned as a commercial area. So if that Walmart does not exist anymore, it is currently zoned for commercial. So something else commercial will have to go there. There are certain limitations to what can be built, but the zoning and land use regulations, they can change. They're somewhat flexible, and so previously areas that were residential were downzoned to industrial. That is a change that can happen in a planning office, and this zoning those areas to be industrial allowed for industries that were bringing hazardous materials, such as a waste site. We're allowing these to go into areas that had mostly people of color, and lower income communities. And there's examples of this that happened in New York and Chicago and all over the country. And this was how it was done. And I think a lot of it was seen as, oh, well, they went into these lower income areas because they had low land values already. And that was what attracted those industries. But I think if we look at the planner's role in it, they still allowed it to take place.
And they don't account for why those areas had low land values. They had low land values because, and it's ironic that I'm going to use this term, Black lives are undervalued. And so a neighborhood where Black people live, from a market perspective, is determined less valuable than a neighborhood where white people live, even if that neighborhood has similar physical amenities.
Yeah, no, that's true. And there's a quote that white land is more valuable by virtue of its whiteness.
Yeah.
And so white land is not seen as attractive by a business that wants to build a waste facility, because whiteness in itself is seen as more valuable. And, you know, whites already at this time were, moving out to suburbia, and they were just seen as overall undesirable. So it's kind of a theme, and as we go through this episode, of the treatment of blacks, how blacks were perceived, the prejudice and discrimination that took place, all continued to aid in our further setbacks.
Yeah.
and our health, and our wealth, and just our overall quality of life. And so I think a lot of people, when they do not know this history, they're like, oh, well, they chose to live there, or, it's not my fault that happened. But it's really a set of practices and policies that were set out to intentionally marginalize these communities. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I had about the environment. But yeah, I think it wasn't until Clinton, and we'll talk about this later, but it wasn't until the Environmental Justice Executive Order that there were some, things put into place. But as we can see in a lot of Native American and indigenous communities, this is still going on. The environmental justice fight, like housing, is far from over.
And I think more than a change in our concern of the siting of hazardous industry is the advancement of technology and the need to be less polluting, if that makes sense. And I think the fact that we see in some ways less environmental pollution in Black and brown communities is not necessarily because they've been equally distributed across all communities, but more because technology has made it feasible and our national level policies have made it more difficult for those industries to pollute. Plus, we outsource a lot of that ugly, dirty industry to other countries. And so now...
Yeah, that is another part of it.
It's not necessarily that we became any better at looking at environmental justice. We just made the problem disappear and go to other people's places. And it's not that strategic. But yeah, we're going to have a whole episode dedicated to... So we talked a lot about problems. Like, here's what planning did from public housing. Here's what planning did from mortgages. Here's what planning did in environmental. Here's what planning did in highways. Here's the actions of these great planners. But we do want to talk about some of the attempted remedies, we'll call them, that were implemented recently to try to address some of these inequalities. And we'll talk about that in a future episode. But we wanted to give the issue a big focus. That's why this episode is so long and it has two parts, because racism in America and the way that urban planning perpetuates racism in America is a long topic. And trying to even summarizing it here felt like we didn't do it enough justice, but I hope that we can point you all in the direction of great sources where you can find more information and you can educate yourself further, and that we just kind of dipped your foot into the topic of planning and racism. And if anyone listening that works in the planning profession, I hope that you're using your skill set for good and not for evil, honestly.
Yeah, and I think for those who are maybe listening, who are not working in the planning profession, continue to think and ask questions about where you live and how that area came to be and what's around you, who has access to those spaces and who may not, and how history plays a role into that as well. So,
and be active. I think that's kind of my biggest concern about urban planning is we try to close the door off to people who don't have planning degrees or architecture degrees or engineering degrees, but residents are the expert of their neighborhood. Like, they know the ins and outs of their community way better than any expert who knows InDesign could possibly know their community. And I think that I'd like to see more people be on their city council boards and be on their planning boards, and not just the same people who've been on it for 50 or 60 years and become kind of career politicians.
Yeah.
If you live in a place and you care about where you live, then you're a planner and you can do things to shape your neighborhood better than I could if I don't know where you live and I'm just coming in with my degree to tell you what I heard is the best practices, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we want to add about today's episode? I know it was really long.
No, I think that's it. I think we touched on it all. So probably go ahead and call it, and stay tuned for more interesting topics and how they relate to you and your daily life and how you're living.
Peace out, y'all.